We have also to mention, for who is here in the room in person, that we have a shared invitation with those who regularly attend the Geneva with Plastic Pollution Dialogues, where we have many times addressed the issue of the importance of having a human rights approach in this new plastics treaty, various sessions where some of our guests today have also been participating. And indeed, we launched these Toxic-Free Talks 3 years ago in 2021, with the first event that was looking at the report that the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Marcos Orellana, was presenting to the General Assembly that year. That report was entitled "The Stages of the Plastics Treaty and Their Impact on Human Rights." And we were ahead of the United Nations Environment Assembly that adopted the resolution, that famous resolution that asked UNEP to convene an intergovernmental negotiating committee to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. And that intergovernmental negotiating committee has already met a few times. Many of all the guests that have joined us today have been attending some of these sessions and making inputs into that process. So your report, Mr. Special Rapporteur, was looking at the impacts of plastics on human rights, as well as the elements of a human rights-based approach in a new legally binding global instrument. So you were very much on the top of what was expecting us. So now we are 3 years later after this report. Where do we stand? What's your take on the journey of the 3 years after this report that you presented to the General Assembly? And also to mention to who is online with us that these Geneva Toxic-Free Talks are convened with the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, and a series of other actors, including Earth Justice and the Center for International Environmental Law. Dr. Orellana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diana, and thanks once again to the Geneva Environment Network for partnering in these Geneva Toxic-Free Talks, also with Justice and the Center for International Environmental Law in this year's edition. And the topic at hand couldn't be more important in the road to what is at least at this time scheduled to be the last meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee that has been tasked with preparing a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. As you rightly pointed out, Diana, thank you for that introduction. The thematic report that I presented to the UN General Assembly on the stages of the plastic cycle and their impact on human rights, before the UN Environment Assembly that decided to kick off negotiations towards a plastic pollution treaty. And precisely one of the recommendations in that report was for the for such negotiations to proceed. So in that sense, that recommendation was taken on, and where are we since? A couple of years have passed. We have seen what the INC, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, has done, and in the formal documents, we see a text of, 70 or 80 plus pages of hundreds of brackets in them, and so that would give the sense that not much has happened, and that is in part that it's been very slow, and that has been in part because of the difficulties in dealing, first of all, on the process and on the direction, on what is it that we are really looking for here. Very different views as to what is the ultimate goal and endpoint in that process. Let me step back perhaps and highlight a couple of points from that report that you mentioned, Diana, report to the General Assembly. Point that every stage of the plastics cycle has adverse implications for human rights. And in order to address plastics and their impact on human rights, each of the stages need to be addressed in this instrument under negotiation. This point was captured in the UN Environment Assembly resolution and it should inform the contents of the instrument at hand. That's first. Second, because of human rights impacts, also human rights principles, language, and a human rights-based approach are indispensable for an equitable and effective instrument. So the solutions must be grounded on human rights. Solution of the plastic pollution threat cannot come at the expense of human rights. And so that's where a human rights-based approach is so important. And this needs to be reflected, as Ambassador from Costa Rica mentioned in the side event yesterday on this issue. It is an imperative for human rights to be involved if we are going to effectively solve the plastic pollution problem. And so explicit language on human rights in various key parts of the treaty, certainly the preamble, but beyond that, on issues concerning the objectives, concerning the means of implementation, the right to development, for example, concerning chemicals of concern and access to information and the right to science, reporting and access to information. There are several other rights that I could refer to, but for the sake of time, I also wish to point out that in addition to explicit language, key human rights principles should also be reflected, perhaps not with explicit language, but certainly reflected. And prevention of harm is certainly key. And that is where reduction of production plastics is so important, because if we are going to simply have a waste management instrument that channels some international cooperation or national action plans so small islands can pick up plastic trash from their beaches, that's not going to work as a sustainable solution. It's going to impair the island's source of income for those that depend on tourism, for example. It's not effective. So instead, what needs to happen, given the expected volumes of production, is for there to be effective controls on volumes. And it's not just the amount, but it's also what goes into the plastics. It has been explained in the metaphor that plastics in a way is like the spaghetti, and then the chemicals added are like the sauce with the, and there's so many types of spaghetti sauces, and that's because plastic play a number of roles in our economies, and that's where chemicals do come in. And so to a large degree, this is about waste, this instrument, but it's also about chemicals, and that's where chemicals of concern come in. At a very minimum, those chemicals that are controlled elsewhere should be reflected in this instrument, but there's so much more. There are chemicals that are controlled by national laws, those should be controlled as well, and there should be clear mechanisms to make sure that hazardous chemicals are kept out of plastics so that we do not aggravate the toxification of our planet, which is one of the key problems that as humanity we're facing in this triple planetary crisis. There are other principles stemming from human rights, in addition to prevention, that are important here, such as the polluter pays principle. I've talked about a global tax on producers. I've talked about extended producer responsibility schemes beyond boundaries, so as to give effect to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities as well. There's also the principle of just transition. And I think this is important to mention because I've heard arguments in the negotiations that human rights can be dealt with and should be dealt with only in respect of the rights of waste pickers that stand to lose their income if we have strong controls. Well, that's an important point, but from an environmental and human rights policy making, we can anticipate that the changes that are needed in order for the transition towards sustainable patterns of production and consumption that are affected, there will be costs. And so that's where human rights, the promise is left behind. But it's not the promise that there won't be changes. The changes are necessary. plastic pollution needs to be tackled. It needs to be tackled in a way that there's a just transition. There's a number of issues that we could elaborate further as to whether we'll have a vote. I mentioned in the side event that there are some participating negotiating states that are adamant against having a vote. I mentioned that without a vote, the international covenants, the Bill of Rights would not be in place. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Social Rights, they were developed, negotiated through a vote. And look at those records and see how the various positions unfolded. I also mentioned in the side event about how a framework convention is not the appropriate approach here, that COP decisions can guide the instruments towards greater effectiveness, but they cannot substitute for what needs to be a content of the instrument. Framework conventions and multilateral environmental agreements were designed to deal with situations where the uncertainties prevented the adoption of clear obligations to handle threats. So the point was to bring the parties to the table, to set up the frameworks, to have additional science, and we go from there. That scenario is very different here. There are certainly uncertainties, but we have enough science to move forward. So the instrument, in my view, in order for it to be robust and effective, needs to establish strong protections, strong controls, clear obligations, and a framework convention does not do that. So much more could be said, Diana, everyone, but for the sake of time, I think I'll stop there. I'm very pleased to have the chance to discuss these issues with stellar panelists and also others in the room. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Special Rapporteur. Our next guest, sitting close to you, is Ana Paula Souza, who is part of the environmental team of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This team has been quite active, also making contributions to this process. You have you reminded yesterday, you were also part of the panel of the side event that was organized yesterday, and you reminded our audience that the challenges to address human rights in the plastics treaty are huge. And as I was mentioning, the Office of the High Commissioner has been making key contributions on the human rights considerations for these negotiations. What would you add, Ana Paula, to what the Special Rapporteur has already put here on the table?
It's always difficult to come after the Special Rapporteur. He's always, every time he speaks on this subject, he's always adding more and more angles to the complexity that it is to deal with this plastic crisis that we face. And also thank you for all the organizers of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. This is such a space, and I'm really sorry there is only once a year that you come to Geneva. I wish we could do this in every session of the Council because it's needed. And the reason that it's needed is that plastic pollution is touching every ecosystem in the planet. It's interacting with climate change, with biodiversity. It is also with other environmental crises such as desertification. Look at the situation in the oceans and so on. But not only that, and I think something that is not enough being said is how plastic pollution it's an obstacle for the right to development. It impacts the right to development in all its three, it impacts sustainable development in all its three dimensions. And I would like to explain just a little bit how this is seen. So environment, we already, I've just mentioned how it touches all ecosystems, impacts on emissions, impacts on fauna, flora, and impacts also on social impacts our bodies. I think virtually there is nobody that is untouched by plastics, and that is very scary. But there are some bodies, they are impacted disproportionately. So I think we cannot avoid closing our eyes for the impact that plastics has on workers working on recycling, informally or formal workers, but also on indigenous peoples, fence-line communities, and so on. But it also has an economic impact. And it's also seeing that plastic is a cheap solution, and because it's a cheap solution, it actually supports development. But actually, very little is talked about how production and use of plastics is actually, those costs are larger in the market. And the reason for, I think, is because of the externalities are much larger than the economic earnings of the plastic industries. Like making reference also to what the Special Rapporteur has said, or impacts that it can have, for example, the tourist industry. There are estimates that suggest that developed countries, these developing countries, despite consuming less plastics, incur a total lifetime plastic cost that is 10 times higher than developed countries. And I think those figures need to come a lot more to the front and center of the discussion, because there are other studies that estimate that only in 2015, and by then we have increased by a lot the amount of plastic production, the related cost, only health-wise, of plastic production exceeded $250 billion globally. And we are not talking here about waste management, for example, costs related. When there are floods, and more we are seeing like those flash floods, we also see that the water is not going down fast enough. And when you see what is in the clogs, what is clogging the tubes, you're going to find a lot of plastic there. So those are costs that are not in the estimate of 2015 of the 250 billion. And that is another point that I think is also very important to have in mind, is that there is a difference between referring to environment and health, and referring to the right to health and the right to a health environment. When you add health and environment, they are concepts. The moment that you add right to health and right to a health environment, you're actually attaching it to something which is much more concrete, which is our obligations. And something that I think is very important that states, delegates, because they are ultimately the ones making the decision in relation to the treaties, that they already have obligations in relation and on how in relation to plastic pollution. And some of those obligations, and I am drawing from the report of the Special Rapporteur on that he submitted to the General Assembly in 2021, wasn't it? And some of those obligations are the obligation to protect against harmful exposure to pollution, which is associated to the obligation to prevent exposure. And this draws from the right to life, to the right to health, but also participation, the right to participation in the design and implementation of plastic policies, the right to access to information, including on environmental and health hazards. And this we already see language similar to in relation to, for example, in the Stockholm Convention. So we are not creating anything new so far. And also the right to access to justice. Of course, we know there is a challenge because plastics is a global industry with transboundary impact. So I think that there has to be more thinking and that on how to ensure access to justice in relation to plastic pollution. But also, which is a very important obligation, that is to prevent harmful exposure by business activities. At the same time, how do we move from those, how those obligations could be translated into the treaty? I think on that, the Special Rapporteur has already outlined elements they are there, including the reduction of production and the production, moving to a hazard approach, the role of science, how do we need to protect the right to science? So, and this comes, sometimes we complicate our lives, but the answer is very simple. If we want all decision-making to be informed by science, if science is corrupt in the sense that science is not informed, is not neutral, then the decisions they are going to lead, that they are going to be used by the science, is also going to be corrupt. So there is a chain there. So we need to work very hard to ensure that the science, and I hope there will be a subsidiary body created that will be focused on science, will be protected. But if there is one thing that I would like to emphasize in concluding is that if human rights are not mentioned in the treaty, doesn't mean that they are not going to be applicable. It just means that we are going to have to go to, like, there will be a decision a lot in courts. Because as I said, the obligations are already there, and they are upon every single country in this. All member states already have those obligations. If it's to inform policy making and to make it coherent with that decision, that's why it needs to be included there. So it's actually a tool to make sure that we are not going to just remember that plastics impacts human rights when it's too late, and this is being decided by a court. So I really hope that right now, as the discussions are going, there is some language. Everything is bracketed in the current document. There is like more than 3,000, close to 4,000 brackets. But there is human rights language in the preamble, in the principles, and it's very important that there has human rights language in the principles, because that will inform the implementation of the other obligations in the treaty. And there is some reference on just transition. But we really also need to see more human rights language also coming as part of the obligation of international cooperation, which comes also technology transfer, which also comes with capacity building, and comes with a very fair, equitable, and effective financial mechanism to be able to ensure that countries that do not have the resources to monitor the implementation of the treaty, or have research skills that will be able to find alternatives that are no toxic, no harmful to plastics, actually have a chance to do so. I think this is a topic that I'm very passionate, and I can over, so please, Diana, stop me. But thank you very much.
So let's move to next guest, co-organizing this discussion with us, Andrés del Castillo, from the Center for International Maritime Law. Those who are familiar to the INC process know Andrés. He has been attending all the sessions. So civil society has also been pushing very much the need for human rights-based approach and the treaty and on state obligations in relation to address plastic pollution. So what do you want to share with us on that? And I know you have prepared some slides that my colleagues will now also share on the screen.
Just first, thank you, Diana, for the invitation and for being always supporting the work that civil society and other key actors are doing in Geneva. And I guess this kind of exercise of Geneva Toxic-Free Talks Week is a very important tool to highlight things that are happening not only in Geneva, but are connecting with the different processes abroad. This time I will take you to a journey in a paradisaic island of Fiji, but with some kind of not good news. And first, this is not a fake magazine cover, but in July this year, Time magazine published a picture of Asinet Leva Beka, who is an inhabitant of Suva in Fiji, and she's burning plastics in front or really close to her house. And she never imagined in her life to be the cover of the Time magazine, and none either to be the cover because there was too much plastic. That's one of the only solutions is to burn that. So just to highlight the importance of putting a human face to the crisis that we are living right now. And with this, I will continue my presentation by just recalling what the UN Secretary General is saying, and is the message for the negotiators, that mainly what he says is plastic are fossil fuels in another form, and he highlights that there are serious threats to human rights, climate, and biodiversity. And as the previous panelists say in the past, he's calling the negotiators to work towards having a plastic treaty that actually substantially phase down production and consumption. So after this context, it's also important to clarify a little bit what we are talking when we talk about plastic pollution. And I give an example of one of the leaders of the indigenous caucus that is participating in the negotiations. That is Nancy Gonzalez from the collective and single-use plastics. And in the town, many of the leaders, of the environmental leaders, have been criminalized because they oppose to big multinationals to bring plastics in their territory. So this is something that I want to highlight here, also by saying what she understands as microplastics, right? Microplastics can be defined scientifically as particles of plastic that are measured less than 5 millimeters. But for them, it's a new form of silent and invisible violence against their bodies. This is very important to have in mind because it's a different concept of how we see those threats. And on microplastics, now we have more and more science telling us that there are microplastics in different parts of our bodies. And every 2 weeks you have more information about where they found microplastics. But then let me also mention and highlight what we understand by plastic pollution, because sometimes this is something where mainly at the beginning, many reports refer plastic pollution equals plastic waste into the environment. But we understand that the OECD in 2022, with a very important report, highlight that plastic pollution is broadly all the risk and emissions during the production, use, disposal, and leakage of plastics. And under this perspective, we need to pair that with what we understand as one of the main tools when it comes to human rights and business, and what are the expectations and responsibility for business. And is what John Ruggie said on the definition of human rights due diligence as a process to identify and managing the risk of human rights impacts, right? So after this, I just want to keep in the very positive journey of different violations and abuses related to human rights, and also how already the UN and human rights international infrastructure mechanisms are reacting to the crisis. And we have examples from reports from other organizations that have been putting magnifying glasses, for instance, in the recycling sector in Turkey. And as we know, or maybe if you don't know, Turkey is one of the main recipients of plastic waste from Europe, mainly. And what Human Rights Watch found there is children working in recycling facilities, for instance, and many people in vulnerable situations working without the conditions that they need to work. And also, the Human Rights Watch released a report on a sacrifice song called "The Cancer Alley," and one of the main takeaways is the title, which is difficult to say, but it's "We Are Dying Here." And on that, we have already reactions from the different special rapporteurs that have been saying that this environmental resistance must end, right? And this is important to say because when special rapporteurs and the UN is choosing the words to condemn something, they are very conscious about how strong they need to be. And this is a very, very strong call on that. But it's not only special rapporteurs. I can also highlight that the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, already in 2002, when it was examining or giving observations to the United States, they highlight the risk of petrochemicals and the indiscriminate number of petrochemicals that have been built in the US and in that specific area. And the CERT recommend the US to start a moratorium on the expansion of new facilities. So far, just to give you a number, there are around 1,400 new facilities plans that will be built in the world from 2023 to 2027. So there is a huge exacerbation of the problem here that we are already struggling to solve. So I want to stop here, but you will have the presentation after, where you can click into the headline and see the different reports that inform that the situation is not isolated, is not only concentrated to specific places. It covers the full life cycle of plastics, and this is gonna get worse. Sorry for keeping the pessimistic message. And as already was highlighted by the special rapporteur, you have when we talk about the plastic crisis, we talk about a health crisis together paired with the environmental and climate one, and we have already effects on human bodies since the extraction of phase of plastics, then the production and the disposal too. That has been very well documented, including a new umbrella report that was launched 2 weeks ago with 5 specific group of chemicals that concluded that none of those group of chemicals can be considered safe for plastics, right? And here we're gonna go to something that we didn't mention yesterday, that is more the granularity of what it means when we talk about human rights and the current plastic treaty, right? And first, it's important to mention that the negotiation started kind of at the same time, or at the same moment that, not by coincidence, but it's by more awareness of the international community of the importance of the recognition at the UN level of the the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, both by the Human Rights Council, then the UN General Assembly. Then it's important also to highlight that this a human rights-based approach, for instance, won't create new obligations, but will crystallize the obligation that already exist, and that what we can see is also that at least like all the countries that are, or nations that are members of the UN, have already ratified at least 2 of the international conventions on human rights. So this is important also to bring into consideration that we are talking already about a minimum, a floor of consensus. Then I will put the magnifying glass on the procedural rights on the plastics treaty that already Ana Paula mentioned, and this intersection with what we understand as foundational steps on environmental governance at the international level. We have the 1972 the Stockholm Declaration, but then kind of the update of that declaration of the complementarity aimed with the Rio Declaration, where you will have under the Principle 10 an environmental democracy framework for environmental governance. So, and here I want to mention also that there are other conventions at the regional and the international level that already have been ratified by more than 50 countries that include and elaborate more on the right, on the different procedural rights and how that applies to different issues related, for instance, to the environment. And it's important to mention here that under the Aarhus Convention, since the beginning of the negotiation of the Plastics Treaty, there have been an interest by the members to look at how the participation is happening and is guaranteed for the different right holders and stakeholders. Also, to be in line of what the UNIA resolution say, that they need the widest and most effective participation, right? And this is not something that you say, and you claim, but you do. And this is what we are here as stakeholders and right holders to always recall the importance of those principles. So as has been said in the past, there are some gaps in the current version of the text, and I will just show you for the people that are mainly online can visualize where in the current version of the draft of the Plastics Treaty we can find language on human rights. But what I'm going to do is just a Control F exercise using a keyword that is rights. But this is not the only way how we can see or analyze or understand that rights, human rights angle is a part of the Plastics Treaty, but we need an express and direct call for that, right? And here, I won't read everything, as was said by Ana Paula, reading the preamble. It's important to have language, right? And you have many things in brackets, and you have these mentions so far that in particularly look at the right to development, right to explore their own resources, right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and indigenous people's rights, and right to present and future generations. Then you have also under the principles, the promotion, respect and protection of human rights, the rights of the holders of such knowledge like indigenous peoples too. And again, the right to development that have been mentioned different times there, with different interpretation of what it means, the right to development. And sometimes under our opinion is weaponization of this right in benefits of the business as usual or the status quo, right? But then there's another keyword that you can use when you do a control F exercise that is also looking at the different groups, peoples or person in vulnerable situation, like by looking by indigenous peoples or women or children or waste speakers or frontline communities. In this case, I just put indigenous peoples, and you have not the mention of rights, but you have already one of the specific procedural rights that is mentioned there, in particular for indigenous peoples, right? So then when we talk about the substance of the treaty, we find only a specific mention on rights under one of the standalone obligation or possible obligation, that is the just transition one. And then you have mentions also to ILO just transition guidelines and right to development again, and as well as the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And this is an interesting development that happened in the last INC in Ottawa. Then in just transition, you have another option that is mentioning and highlighting the role of waste speakers and impacted communities in general. And then you have also the mention of rights, but more specifically when we talk about capacity building and technology transfer, but it's about proprietary rights. And this is not the sense that we are using the word rights here, at least not in this room, but it's important to mention that is mentioned there. So for us, this is not a wish list, but is where CL has been identified the critical areas where human rights-based approach need to be integrated, right? That includes, of course, preambular and principles, if there will be a standalone provision of principles, then on what is called primary plastic polymers, that is how to control from the supply side measures the production of plastics, then chemicals of concern, as was highlighted already by the Special Rapporteur, and what in trade and products is important, and transparency and monitoring and labeling. This is aligned with the right to information, right? And then on finance, it's very important to keep also safeguards to make sure that any mechanism that is developed either by the treaty or by the governing body of the treaty has specific guidelines that will protect the most vulnerable and the people in general from the options that will be put in place to overcome the plastic pollution crisis, right? And I was giving an example earlier to one of the panelists today on how now it's very trendy to claim that big events are zero waste or climate neutral, right? And one of the Super Bowls in the US, that is one of the biggest events for football in the US, was claiming, well, not this one, the one of this year, but last year, that they were zero waste. But when there were some investigations saying that what they did is they sent the plastic waste to Mexico, specifically to one facility that is close to the border in Mexicali, to recycle. But the problem is that there is water scarcity, and people are struggling and having very, very serious problems to access to water. But because there is this plant that is using a lot of the water resources for recycling waste that is not even produced there. So this is just an anecdotal example of how things are. But thank you so much. I will wrap up here.
Thank you very much, Andres. I'm just looking at Ana Paula and the Special Rapporteur. Anything you would like to add to what Andres just mentioned? We can move to our next speaker.
Perhaps I would go even more and expand the list from Andres. I think that this treaty is going to look into participation. I mean, how will rights holders be engaging, participating at the national, but also in the POPs, no? Mm-hmm. And I think that there is a need to make this truly participatory, more than like, oh, I have an accreditation, I may be able not to speak for 1 or 2 minutes if I come to the room, and now to ensure that those voices. So I think that there are a role to make it like indigenous peoples, waste speakers. Some of those front and fence line communities have even more like a role in the work in informing the COP. The Conference of the Parties, that once the treaty is into force. Access to information is also key. I think that there's a lot of references to proprietary rights, but there is also reference trying to limit access to information because of industry interests. If something harms health or has any impact on health, on environment, consumers, we need to know. I think this is not only something that we talk abstract. I'm saying me, myself, as Ana Paula, as a woman in this world, I would like to know if what I'm consuming harms me or not. This should not be come at the expense of some business formula, secret formula. If it impacts, we need to know. So I think that we can go on and see, because it's so entrenched. How can you disconnect plastics with human rights? Again, I think the objective should be, if we are really talking, I think there is no way that it's going to go ahead. But what we are talking is about protecting the right to health and the right to a healthy environment. If we manage to get states to agree there is going to be health and environment, we are already in the state that the negotiations are. This is already a success. If they agree with anything, it's already a success, I would say, at this point. And I really like the point that you have made on how the right to development is being misused to actually limit or as a justification, not for a treaty that will not have the ambition that is required to deal with the size of the crisis. And I think that there is a lot of thinking from states that will need to go into how to understand the right to development as a right that needs to be, within our planetary boundaries. If there is no planet, it's not development, but also the cost of plastics are impacting the right to development.
Let's move to our next guest who's joining us online, Joshua Prentice from Trinidad and sorry.
No, I want to move on. But I did want to react to one point, which is that during the process of negotiations, we have now the benefits of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea's advisory opinion on climate change, and that is, I think, important to look into. So bear with me for a couple of points. One of them is, if we recall last year's social forum here at the Council under the leadership of Iran, there was a big focus on science. I came into the forum and spoke about the right to science and the duty to align regulatory measures with the best available scientific evidence. The advisory opinion of the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea takes this idea into practice. We can draw some elements of that opinion. the tribunal considered that greenhouse gas pollutants are a form of pollution under the Law of the Sea Convention. Well, similar could be said for plastics, microplastics, macroplastics. So that kicks in the regime of protection of the marine environment. And there, science is one of the key criterions to identify the measures that are necessary for the prevention, reduction, and control of pollution. So those are minimum standards set in these negotiations in other international fora that need to be taken into account or given effect depending on the medium and the source of the pollution in regards to plastic pollution. I think this is quite important because it underlies the point that Ana Paula made. We are not negotiating, as it were, in a vacuum or from scratch. There is a landscape that establishes human rights obligations. There is a landscape that establishes international obligations for the protection of the marine environment. It would be quite ironic, to say the least, for the Plastic Pollution Treaty to lower somehow the levels of protection, instead raise the levels of protection. And if the Paris Agreement that dealt with the existential threat of climate change was able to articulate human rights in explicit language, the right to development, understood as a meaningful participation in the process of development, not just simply economic growth. That is a misunderstanding. If the Paris Agreement was able to do that, how are we not going to be able to do that again? Thank you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Special Rapporteur. So let's continue with Joshua, who is joining us online from Trinidad and Tobago. Joshua has been the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform's plastic pollution thematic focal point. He has coordinated youth remotely for the first 3 INCs and attended in person in Kumo, and is also planning to be in Busan later this year. So you have heard Joshua, our speakers, also mentioning that including clear provisions for the protection of human rights is about crystallizing obligations that already exist. What is the youth perspective on this? How are you looking forward at the world of tomorrow for you, your colleagues, and the future generations? How are you contributing to this discussion?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me. All of my previous colleagues and panelists made extremely good points. In fact, a lot of them are currently in the discussion points I will be speaking about today. So after our position on human rights in this international legal instrument stems from multiple points and research papers. And I say papers, I mean previous resolutions. The main point of interest for human rights into the LBI are, like my previous panel said, that there are existing works that already exist with regards to human rights in the UN system. We're making reference to UN General Assembly Resolution A76L75, where it's the right to a healthy, clean, and sustainable environment. Now, in a small and developing state like Trinidad and Tobago, plastic pollution is a scourge, and it hampers our right to enjoy our environment. Our coastlines are currently littered. In case of Trinidad and Tobago, for a small developing state, we are a very high producer of plastic. And because of that, due to lack of waste management and waste sorting, plastic waste have lots of leakages into our marine environment, which end up causing harm to multiple ecosystems and humans within this country via mechanical injuries such as stepping on plastic, getting cut by plastic made things, and especially the degradation of our environment due to plastic pollution. With regards to priorities as well, we're trying to tie this intellectually legal abiding instrument to the triple planetary crisis, which is a human rights notion, in the sense that climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution are all intertwined in this treaty. As plastics interact with this, the triple planetary crisis, as plastics, like the UN General Secretary said, that Plastic production is another form of oil and gas, in the sense that it comes from oil and gas subsidies and products. Thus, when companies and produce plastics and polymers, they are indirectly feeding into the climate change crisis, and as well as plastic pollution is a form of pollution. And the plastic pollution then spirals into biodiversity loss via loss of species and biodiversity due to injuries and other forms of interaction with plastics. There's also a human rights-based approach as well when regards to work. Currently, the ILO estimates that 1/5 of all waste management and recycling jobs globally, or the workers of these jobs, are not formally employed. There's also cases of children being employed as waste pickers globally, especially in the global south, in countries within Africa and Asia, where instead of being in school and having like I said, enjoying a healthy and clean life, they're forced to work in these toxic environments. As well as we're also trying to make reference to and also get protections for fence line communities that my colleagues mentioned earlier. There have been cases in countries such as America and other developed countries, sorry, where there have been companies set up in impoverished areas, such as in New Orleans, in Louisiana, right next to impoverished community, because they don't have the means to properly advocate for the non-placement of these plastic polymer production companies. And as a result, the toxic fumes that they produce and byproducts negatively impact the residents and also children in these areas. We also want to make reference and get these things referenced in the text itself, where we want to make sure that the text references vulnerable populations who are disproportionately impacted, such as children, youth, indigenous communities, uh, and we also want to make reference that these things aren't existing in a vacuum in this treaty. They have already been referenced in conventions such as the Paris Agreement, the Minamata Convention on Mercury, and also the recently made Global Framework on Chemicals. Now, chemicals of concern was something that's referenced earlier in this panel, in fact, just by my colleague Andreas. And this is a very important point in the sense that we don't know what we're putting into our bodies. Chemicals of concern are a very contentious point within this treaty because we still need to research and understand what chemical compounds does what to our bodies. And there's also a precaution principle in the Rio Declaration where if there's an instance where something can cause harm to us, we should shy away from that. There needs to be more management of chemicals of concern with regards to the placement of these compounds into our into plastics, and also manage how these plastics with hazardous compounds are recycled, or the life cycle of them, in the sense that we don't want them to end up in the environment, which can end up leaching toxic chemicals where humans, indigenous communities, or vulnerable populations rely on the environment to exist. As well as, sorry, we also want to ensure or enshrine in the internationally legally binding instrument the some mechanisms in that already exist in the Aarhus Convention, where we like to see the public and also civil society being able to report entities, companies for non-compliance. Now, we understand that that'll be a very big ask because currently the ILBA is in a very premature stage, but that's something we would really push for to see, because as we move forward from the treaty and into its hopeful conclusion later this year in Busan, and also moving forward into the sector being formed and COPs moving forward, we want to ensure that there are reporting mechanisms for non-compliance. Countries that sign up and ratify and the CETA treaty, they need to ensure that targets are being met and the treaty itself is being achieved. We also want to ensure, and our main priority is engagement of civil society and stakeholders. Now, through the UN process, that is an issue, but we want to ensure that civil society and stakeholders are able to engage in not just this treaty, like my colleague rightfully said, and just get an accreditation badge and maybe given a 1, 2, 3-minute intervention after members here have spoken, but to actually achieve tangible targets through the execution of this treaty itself by engaging locally and nationally regionally, and even at the sector level to achieve the targets being met. This treaty itself relates heavily to human rights because it involves all of us. Every single industry, every single person on this planet is impacted by this treaty and will be impacted by plastics moving forward. Microplastics are a huge issue of concern that we need to address as well regarding human rights, because our bodies being infected with microplastics and in ways that we haven't yet to understand yet. There have been studies that have came out recently through scientific journals that have shown that there are microplastics in our blood. How are the compounds found in microplastics interacting with our hormonal changes in our body, interacting with developmental changes in children and youth? We have yet to understand that. Therefore, everybody is affected and everybody needs to be on board with this treaty. And it's essentially why it's so contentious, because it's a very important one, but there are currently hold-ups. Thank you all for listening. I hope you all enjoyed my points. I'll be happy to connect with all of you after as well. And if you want to get in touch with me, please feel free to get in contact. The Global Coalition on Plastic Pollution will be engaging in INC5 in Busan, and I hope to see all of you there. Thank you for listening to my points, and I hope you liked our points on human rights in this plastic treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joshua. We are indeed already have been talking for almost 1 hour. We started a little bit late, so let's, if you still have time before we close, I'm looking at the audience here, those at least who are joining in person. If you would like to add something to the points that have been raised, you would like, please, if you could also briefly introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'm from Permanent of Iran. Thank you to you as a Geneva Environmental Network that already and always invites us to events, and also thank to the panelists, especially our reporters and other colleagues from the other initiatives. I would like just to, it's clear for everybody that it needs plastic pollution treaty. It is necessary for all the world and for developing, underdeveloped, and developed countries. I think common idea, but there is some differences we should manage it during the negotiation. The benefits or interest of the least developed countries, developing countries, and developed countries. What I would like to raise is that the developing country developed during the unregulated area. They develop without any restriction, develop without any comment and any regulation. But nowadays, if the LDCs and also maybe developing country would like to develop, there are some restriction and also some, I should say, regulated issue. In this sense, I think we should put some barrier on developed countries. For example, in the field of transfer of technology, because the developing countries needs this kind of technology to do process their products. Maybe they provide better products than nowadays they are producing. They need, I think, the financial instrument, as we saw in the COP28, something loss and damage fund, something like that. And also, I think the important issue is the differentiated responsibilities is also other essential issue regarding the negotiation. But for us, as a developing country, we need, and everybody knows that we should reduce the consumption and production of the plastic materials. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the panel to see if you want to add to this point that has been made, or anybody else who wants to react. You were vocal on the right to development. Do you want to add something? Final word to the Special Rapporteur.
Special Rapporteur, I don't know if you want to say some words on that. In relation to the technology, that is something that it's part of the state's obligation, international cooperation. So that is something that as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we are very vocal. Not always states, and then see like on plastics, but you can see in the beer, as you can see in many other MEAs, not all states have the same capacity, not even to monitor if they are being able to implement some control measures or not. So technology transfer is key. But something that we need to understand is like plastics will kill, harm the health of human beings. And these human beings, it doesn't matter which borders they come from. If it will impact the health of a baby born in a developed country in an LDC states, because we are humans, we are made of the same, so the question for me, and I'm very happy that you mentioned this point, is like, how do you make sure that this treaty has a very strong financial mechanism that is equitable, and meaning that who has to contribute more, but also is based on technology transfer. But that doesn't imply that it should not reduced, and we should not think of designs that are not going to be based on the same mistakes we have done in the past, meaning that what we know as regretful solutions. So I think we also need to make sure that if we are circling back, that the product is not actually more toxic than it was originally the case. So I think I'm happy that you raised. I think that the right to development, the Office of the High Commissioner, and every INC, we try to put out a document that will help inform some of the thinking we have done on just transition. We have done on the responsibilities of business. This time we are going to do one on the right to development, because we see this as so important, and also particularly if you want this treaty to succeed, it needs to have those elements which are now being discussed as contact group 2 in the negotiation. So thank you for bringing this up, and also thank you for mentioning the need to reduce production and consumption.
Mr. Rapporteur, I can continue, but also conclude. This is also in the last session of the tax-free talk. So while you make your reflections, please also make the formal closing. Thank you.
Thanks. And to add and complement and also reflect on the very important points raised in the room. So on the question of technology, you may recall that the report I presented to the UN General Assembly analyzed what were considered in that report to be either false or misleading solutions. And so the issue of combustion. Some argue, well, why worry about plastics? We can draw energy from plastics if we only burn it. Well, that's simply transferring one form of pollution to another, and that's certainly a problem when we burn plastics. There's all kinds of releases of hazardous substances that are not 100% captured. So that's one, and the other is recycling. Most plastics are not recycled. And that's not only because there's a lack of technology transfer or capacity, but because there's a lack of technology to do it, because they cannot be recycled, because they're such poor quality, or because they're so laden with hazardous chemicals that the result is a concentration of hazardous toxic plastics at the end. And so that is something to keep an eye out on. That would be one point. Second, to underscore certainly the importance of international cooperation and assistance. And in the presentation of my thematic report to Council this year in the interactive dialogue, I pointed out on pollution information portals as a tool for implementation of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. There is a proposal on the table to integrate pollution release and transfer registries into the plastic pollution treaty, much like it happened or was done in the context of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. So there's a concrete tool that can help channel international cooperation and assistance. And then finally, on finance, to echo the point, I spoke about the polluter-based responsibility and global tax, but I do want to elaborate on extended producer responsibility schemes, because they have been a tool to give effect to this principle. But when it comes to transboundary impacts of plastic pollution, this does not work very well. Think about the example of an island that's inundated with plastics. It collects the plastics in the beach. It takes it to a facility. Well, who's going to pay for that? For the treatment of that waste? In an extended producer responsibility scheme, the producer of that plastic would contribute to management of the waste, or the importer of that plastic. But here, there's no producer in the jurisdiction of that island, and there's no import. Where's the producer? Well, there's only a few companies, I would say, or sources of the big polymers. There's certainly a big spread of the petrochemicals that go into the polymers. And so identifying the country of origin of the plastic, and for the producer in that country to contribute to the finance, to deal with the problem. And this will lead me then to closing remarks, which center on accountability. Accountability of those producers for the massive global threat that they have caused and profited for decades from it. There are, as we well know, islands, continent-sized islands of plastics in the sea. They need to be cleaned up. It's not only a matter of reduction of production. It's not only a matter of prevention of exposure in the hazardous chemicals added to plastics. It is not only about sound management of waste, but it's also about the cleanup of the mess that it's already out in the oceans. So the challenge is big, but we want to have faith. We are up to it. We have faced important challenges before, and we are making progress. And this is another opportunity for humanity. We want to come together and deal with this challenge. So with those words, I want to again thank all the speakers in this 2024 edition of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks, all the organizations that have joined hands, the Geneva Environment Network, once again, Earth Justice, Vision and leadership of Yves Lador, the Center for International Environmental Law. We have a lot to do, and I hope these talks and the discussions contribute to a greater understanding and also the willingness to tackle the difficult issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Special Rapporteur. Thank you to all the speakers, to all those who join us online. And just to mention something I forgot at the beginning, as usual, the slides and the summary of the event, the video will be available on the webpage of this event. And I think the link has been shared in the chat and was on the screen for who is here, but it was also in the invitation. So thank you, warm thanks to all of you. And we look forward to see you also at the next edition of the Geneva Pacific Talks and in other events that will target this important issue that we have discussed today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.